wind blows to Coshyville, and with the wind came we, where the river hugs the wood, and blackthorns fall out and made us good, a single round tree. So young and tender, so would you, I loved you both as there you grew. The day I took the road that leads fire enough to the sea.
Stuart McGregor's song Coshyville is a kind of anthem to the days when Highland hydroelectricity was one of Europe's biggest post-war construction projects. Hard to believe if you're a hill walker today, the work that's under your boots. But join together all the tunnels that were driven through the hills to bring water to the dams and power stations, and they would stretch from Inverness to Glasgow.
It's got a familiar smell, this place. It really has, you know. But it must be my imagination, you know, playing on me just now, because I can smell diesel and especially the gelignite smell. It may sound funny, but it's true.
The men who built the dams and drove the tunnels were from Poland and the Ukraine, ex-soldiers, sailors and displaced persons. They were from the islands, brought up in hardship and proud of their hardiness. Above all, they were from Ireland. They worked to the exacting vision of some of Scotland's finest engineering brains. They changed the very look of the Highland hills and glens.
The time I came to Scotland first, I was only about 17 and a half. To tell you the truth, I had to earn my own fare over by making creels, cutting rods and making creels, and planting cabbage plants and selling them. And that was the way I got enough money gathered. When the late spring came, I just headed off for Glasgow.
We locked up one pole one night for his own protection, actually, and he had a bank book in his possession, and he had £7,000 plus in his bank book, which would have bought 2 split new 3-bedroomed houses in these days, believe it or not.
There would be queues and queues of men passing the hatch, and you'd see the hands come out, they'd take the plate, and a lot of them would have fingers missing, and then you gradually got to know the people, and then they would all sit down at the long canteen tables, and they would have their dinner, so called, and then they would go off, and they'd go up to the vans. There were usually a few vans lined up outside, and there they would buy something decent, and they go and make their own dinners in the nissen huts.
It was an exciting time, and I just loved it. Yeah, the scale of things that were going on at that time were pretty amazing, because there weren't many private cars around, and just to see all these buses and trucks with railway lines on the back of them, you know, carrying huge loads of goodness knows what all material. And there was bulldozers, and they made lovely noises. It was just a boy's dream.
The year was 1948. There were about 8 or 10 of us, all engineers at Malardoch, and practically everybody apart from myself had been commissioned during the war. So they had served their war service. They had all sort of had an experience that they never talked of, but I benefited greatly as a young man from the judgments that they had acquired, and I think it was one of the best times of my life. I really enjoyed it.
High above Kinlochleven and to the east of the Glencoe Hills, Blackwater, the first major hydroelectric dam in the Highlands, was built in the early 1900s to provide the immense amount of water power that the bright new industry of aluminium smelting required. With the network of English railways and canals almost completed, Irish navigators, or navvies, flocked in their thousands to the jobs at Blackwater.
In order to get to the village in those days, the quickest way was to come up over the mountain. And we heard stories that when they were coming over the mountain, that they had a very hazardous time. For example, they had, it was said that some people perished in the snow coming over the Devil's Staircase over to the dam. And that some of the people who came and found them there, they observed that they had a good pair of boots. So they took the boots off and put it on themselves and continued on to Kinlochleven.
There was nothing at home for these men from Donegal and elsewhere in Ireland, little more to keep their Hebridean cousins on their crofts. If in these days an American letter home meant one with money in it, a Scottish letter home from Kinlochleven might well have meant the same, and more. Half a century on, brothers Vince and Jimmy Campbell would consciously be part of an Irish migrant tradition, whose bard and chronicler had come from their own village to work on the Blackwater Dam. Out of Patrick McGill's experiences came his masterpiece, the novel Children of the Dead End and a Navvy's Elegy. Bury him deep in the red, red muck and pile the clay on his breast, for all that he needs for his years of toil are years of unbroken rest. And who has mothered this kinless one? Why should we want to know? As we hide his face from the eyes of men, and his flesh from the hooded crow. Had he a sweetheart to wait for him, with a kiss for his toil-worn face? It doesn't matter, for here or there, another can fill his place. The tents and shanties have gone, the gravestones remain, and Blackwater Dam itself, a grim-faced servant to a technology in use since the first water mills ground the first ears of corn. The more water, and the further and faster its flow downhill, the more power. Power for the turbines to turn into electricity.
I understand that when the electricity was supplied to the houses in the first instance, the people didn't pay for it. It was included in the rent of the houses.
Kinlochleven became a Highland boomtown as world demand for aluminium grew with the inventions and wars of the 20th century.
They had more than 5 football teams representing the various departments in the factory. And the cinema was in the village hall. We had talkies at Kinlochleven before many other towns had talkies. It was said at one time that the electric supply was switched on at Kinlochleven and in use a long time before Buckingham Palace had it.
The 20s and 30s saw more dams for the aluminium industry and 15 miles of tunnel driven through Ben Nevis to a second power station at Fort William. Further east, lonely Loch Ericht was dammed in an early harnessing for general supply purposes. But it was to take a Second World War, the shortages it created and the disciplines it imposed before hydroelectricity came into its own.
And Jerry gave us merry hell all across the desert. And when you've chased them up a few more flagpoles, you boys will be coming home, looking for jobs.
Aye. Not me. I'm for the colonies. There's nothing in the Highlands for a man to come back to.
This 1943 government film, unblushingly and unrelentingly propagandist in tone, was scripted by no less a Highlander than novelist Neil Gunn.
I went south 20 years ago. and learned to be an engineer. Now I'm coming back. Do you know why? See that spate of water? That's power. And we've more of that water in the Highlands than anywhere else in Britain.
1943, the blackest period in the war. Incredible. And here a bill is presented to Parliament for the development of water power in the Highlands. It seems screwy.
Scotland must have more control over our own affairs. That is
The screwiness was the acute political judgment and determination of one man, Tom Johnson, socialist historian and journalist and Churchill's wartime Secretary of State for Scotland.
Well, Tom Johnson, for many, many years before the Second World War, he'd always felt that the waters of the Highlands should be developed for public use. Now, in those days, in the 20s and 30s, there was a handful of men in Glasgow, civil engineers, who went for long weekend walks, often dragging their poor wives with them. And these men went round the hills, noting on the backs of envelopes catchment areas, streams, how they're running. So there was a considerable body of material ready. And of course, when Johnson became Secretary of State, he saw this as the great opportunity to do what he had always dreamt of doing.
Hello, neighbor. This is sure a swell country to be lost in, but we'd like...
If Roosevelt had his New Deal for the USA, hydroelectricity was Johnson's New Deal for the Highlands.
It's sure a beautiful country you have here. Yeah, it's a lot like my home back in the Highlands of Tennessee. But before the TVA, it was as godforsaken and wasted as around here.
What's TVA, anyway?
Well, it's the setup of the United States government. TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, to develop the whole Tennessee Valley.
Grandiose comparisons with America, the promise of local industry and prosperity, even, it has been said, hints at a strategic value in developing the atom bomb. Johnson used everything available to promote his vision.
Light up the whole of Europe. Cheap, too. There's work and a good living for everybody. So long, neighbor.
And it could be that the war, in its own way, was a blessing as far as hydropower was concerned, because it gave them the chance.
Pre-war surveys had identified Loch Sloy in the Arrocha Hills west of Loch Lomond as providing an ideal combination of rainfall, water catchment, height above sea level, and proximity to central Scotland. Legislation was rushed through a bullied and distracted Parliament, the North of Scotland Hydroelectric Board established, and the Sloy scheme given the go-ahead. What some saw as the Johnston juggernaut was on its way.
On June the 11th, 1945, an £8 million project started on the banks of Loch Lomond. Mr. Tom Johnson began a job that will take a generation. Mr. Johnson cut the first sod of the Sloy project, the first of 100 new generating stations to be built in 20 years.
Dreams had become plans. Approach roads first, then the dam, and a network of tunnels, aqueducts, pipes and diversions that would gather the waters of the Arrocha Hills into the loch and hold them there like a miser hoarding gold. Nature was the spendthrift. In the first 3 years of Sloy construction, there would be only as many weeks without rain. In the lee of war, machinery and materials were in short supply. The right kind of men were scarce enough too.
I worked in here for Edmund Nuttall and Sons in 1948 until 1950. And this is my first time in 50 years' time. And it brings a lot of memories. I was looking for work. I was fed up with the army life. And the opportunity arose, tunneling, big money. So we were sent over to Johnson Castle in Renfrewshire, got them up there, taken by a lorry to Dumbarton police station, registered there one day, and 2 days later we're in Inveruglas North Camp. It was like home from home. We met the same people, same faces, same language, same everything.
They thought of themselves as tunnel tigers, tearing at the living rock, their teamwork generating a team spirit necessary in such difficult and dangerous conditions.
Safety did not exist. We didn't have the hard hats as what I'm wearing now. In those days, the only hats we wore were our demob soft hats, which served their purpose because it stopped water from going down our necks. There you are. There is a typical fault, very dangerous. And whenever we came across them, we were very, very wary because there was always some loose stones coming down with the water permeating, you know. So we always, there is one loose. You can see it, although it's small. But if you got hit with it on the head without a helmet, you'd have felt it. But if it was 10 times the size, it would kill you.
There were indeed men killed at Sloy, 21 of them. Lech himself had a lucky escape.
The previous day I had a small accident. There was a back blow from one of the machines, and I got a lot of grit and dirt in my ear. So the camp nurse said, "You're not going to work for 3 days." And the very next day there was an explosion in a tunnel that I should have been working. It was a huge bang, and the people that stood in one corner of it, and they were all shocked, but they survived it. And so many men, I can't remember, there were 4 or 5 killed. Among them, it was the main tunnel boss, a big, huge man, you know. It brought us all back to earth and started, you know, being more careful and things like that. But that all went by the wayside. You know, within a week, everything was forgotten. It was back to the usual grind. You know, just work and work and work.
Work, work, work. 5 long years of work, till the pipes, like a triumphant army, could parade their prize of water down Ben Vorlich to the turbines on Loch Lomond's side.
It was a very close-knit community. It was like being in the army. It was a very high price to pay, 21 men. I'm sure I knew most of them by sight. But I knew 2 of them, J. Motic and C. Novak, personally. We should never forget that this was the price paid to make life a bit easier for everybody else in Scotland.
Hard on the heels of Sloy came an even more ambitious plan to develop the potential of the Tummel Valley in northern Perthshire. Parliament had to approve, and Tom Johnston and the North of Scotland Hydroelectric Board had a fight on their hands.
Now, Lochsloy was West Coast, Lochsloy was Glasgow, Lochsloy didn't really matter. But when the board turned its eyes to the Tummel Valley, then the whole scenario changed.
Johnston had found the board's first chairman at the opposite end of the social spectrum from his own, David, 12th Earl of Airlie.
My father spoke in the House of Lords at that time in favour of it. And I think this probably surprised quite a lot of many numbers of the peers there at that time, because quite a number of landowners, amongst others, really had quite serious objections to this whole idea. So they were quite surprised that he, being a landowner himself, actually was in favour of it.
One of the Tummel Valley landowners most vehemently opposed to the Hydro Board's plans was George Freeland Barber.
My father's reaction was very much coloured by the fact that he was desperately fond of this area. The family have been here for many hundreds of years, And he was very knowledgeable both about the history and the natural history, if you like, the wildlife and so on. So he immediately thought that there was a big threat to the landscape. And I think felt that he must get all the assistance he could in building up resistance to the scheme. He decided to get in touch with the National Trust in the hope that they would help in the cause. And as a result of that, he gave land along the riverside walks along the River Garry to the Falls of Tummel to the National Trust. And I think that was a very worthwhile thing to do.
All these forces and others came together and formed really very, very considerable opposition. And that opposition became really quite unpleasant from time to time. And it was quite upsetting, I think, for my father personally, because, in a sense, he was a sort of lightning conductor. He was the figure that everybody would have a go at.
Here you had the might, the great might, of the landed gentry, the riparian owners, the House of Lords, and it was at that point that Johnson realised that Airlie was no fit match for the coming battle.
I was serving in Germany at the time, in 1945, in the Scots Guards, and I got a letter from my father, very distressed, to tell me that he had put me up to be a member of the Perth Hunt Club. And I had been blackballed. And I had been blackballed by a few individuals who had taken grave exception to what was happening to them and the way that they were being affected by the Tummel Garry scheme.
So Lord Airlie was a decent wee man, did the sensible thing, fell on his sword, and Johnson became a chairman, something he had never wanted to do.
With former Secretary of State Johnston at the hydro helm, the impetus became irresistible. Propaganda had done its job. Now it was theodolites and slide rules and the eyes and brains that used them.
And we know we can do it. Already, these great dams supply the lowlands with their power. Now, we're planning to harness the rivers and lochs of the Highlands.
Behind the trumpetings and get-up-and-go excitement of half a century ago lay one basic difficulty.
Believe it or not, Scotland is not ideal hydro country. It's not wet enough and the hills aren't high enough. The average hydro station in Scotland only runs for a third of the time. There's not enough water to actually run for the rest of the time. If you compare hydro in Scotland to hydro in other countries like Norway, Sweden, Canada, the hydro in these other countries tends to be supplied by glaciers, melting glaciers, and the machines run for 98% of the time. Whereas in Scotland, we rely purely on rainfall and storing the water in reservoirs, our average load factor is only about 33% of the time.
Water, water everywhere, but not enough of it. To satisfy the visionaries' thirst, a river that had flowed to the Atlantic since the Ice Age would be diverted into Loch Lyon and thence to the North Sea. From Sloy and Tummel, construction moved west and north to Shirra in Argyll and Breadalbin in Perthshire. Beyond the Great Glen lay the resources of Glengarry, Glenmoriston and Glenafric, and further north yet, Strathfarra, the Connan Valley and Loch Shin.
The big wheels rumble up and down, the lorries know the way. Raise my hand, a hitch a ride, across the bridge at Rannoch side, where the diesel motors play. Setting my face to a cliff of stone, my ear to a boring hammer strong. Inside I rode alone, and you were far away.
Tired of one scheme, or maybe sacked from it, a man could simply move on to another. Hard graft and wretched living conditions meant a high turnover among the labour force, but there were always plenty of new recruits.
Well, I was 18 at the time, and I remember all the ones around our place were away in the Highlands of Scotland, coming home with loads of money, new suits, brand new cars with them on hire, and they had all the girls as well. So I got a wee bit jealous. So one night I was coming home from a dance with my cousin, and we sat on a bridge outside my home. This was about 3 or 4 in the morning, and my cousin says, such a man, his name was Tommy Campbell, no relation, is going back to the Highlands to Scotland on Wednesday. We should go. So I said, if you go, I'll go.
When I came here, there was nothing. And there were only about 3 of us who had come initially. And we went to live in Kozak Lodge, which is just about a quarter of a mile down from the present dam site. And Kozak Lodge was an old shooting lodge that had been used by the royal family of Luxembourg during the war as a kind of retreat. It was a very happy retreat, I could see, because when we opened a stable door outside, we were nearly killed by a fall of bottles, empty bottles, brandy bottles, wine bottles, so there'd been a good war for them.
If empty bottles nearly killed engineer Bob Sim at Malardach, a couple of full ones got joiner Vince Campbell a start in Glen Lyon.
But Bobby said to me, you buy a bottle of dark rum and I'll buy a bottle of whisky. And he knew well that the man that was the shop foreman was very fond of dark rum, and he was Willie Armstrong. And there was another man then, the general, of course. He was Bill Shields, and he was fond of his whisky too. So we came into the camp. Then Bobby said, thought we'd bring you a little present and give them the dark rum and a bottle of whisky. And there was no word of us leaving this camp without getting a job. We had a job straight away. In 1956, I was earning up to 26, 27 pounds. And then you get what you call the ghoster. The ghoster was, you worked your shift, and then the foreman would come around and say, anyone wants to work tonight again? That was a ghoster.
And of course, the higher up the ranking you went, I suppose, they got bigger cut of the cake, you know. So the bosses and the tunnel bosses, you know, they were always there saying, come on boys, you've another so many feet to do and you'll get that much extra.
Everybody wanted to get extra money. So you worked all night and then you had to go back on your same, that's 36 hours, back on the same shift.
The payment system was basic, but there was a certain limit, footage per week. If you achieved that at the end of the week, your weekly pay doubled. And if you broke a British record or a world record, which we did a few times, well, obviously there was added bonuses and things like that, which were, you know, very welcome.
2 teams of tunnel tigers are rushing together. A friendly but hard rivalry develops between opposing teams.
I was a section engineer on a tunnel, and we came on very soft material as we were driving. And it was agreed that it would be a very good idea to try and go for a world record. And we did, in fact, by running 24-hour shifts, drill and construct 557 feet of tunnel in a week, which beat an American record by about 30 or 40 feet.
Good for the wallets, good for morale, and good for the profits of the contractors breaking through as tunnel drive met tunnel drive ahead of schedule. The bonus system and breaking records weren't so good so far as safety was concerned.
The tunnel boss was an Irishman. He was a man that really liked to have a drink now and again, and oftener now than again. But at the same time, he would stand for no nonsense whatsoever, in as much as if other men were found under the influence, he soon actually put them in their place. One other chap who was actually a plate layer, and he liked to drink a drink of methylated spirits. And he used to go down the tunnel where we had tiller lamps for when the power was switched off. And he used to empty the wee jars with the methylated spirits with the starters. And he was a bit of a nuisance.
When you did get bad weather, it was really bad. On one occasion, all the men were at the very end of the road, terrible day, well, a blizzard blowing. And they were in the aluminium shelter, with a big fire going. When somebody opened the door to go in, and the wind went in with them, and away went the shelter. Lefty come, because it was soft aluminium. They just ripped off the sole bolts and away. And apparently some climbers found it on Ben Moor, somewhere in Perthshire. Of course, that would be maybe 2.5, 3 miles away.
Everybody had to wear Wellingtons, and socks wouldn't last too long. And they used to wear, that time, what they call toe rags. If you ever heard the word toe rag. And what that was, you cut a square piece of your blanket on your bed, and you wrapped it around and you put the end of it over your toes and slipped it into your Wellingtons. And then when you come back at night, it wasn't a very nice scene in the camp. All the stoves down with toe rags hanging, drying for the next morning. One night I was nearly gone on that dam. I went out and there was only one plank on the catwalk. And it was under dark kind of, because you had very little light out there. There was lights in the dam itself, but they wouldn't shine over the shutters too well. So I was loosening away and I didn't look, but wasn't the end of the plank going out far more than the girder, or the little bracket that was under. And the plank rose, it wasn't even bolted. They were supposed to be well bolted. And I was just going when I caught this bracket. And if I fell that night, I would say I would have fallen about 70 feet in here. I was finished, I wouldn't be here today.
I was working on survey work one Saturday morning. I was the only engineer on site at the time, and I was busy reading angles for the 2 wings of the dam. And there was a small squad building a road just below me and maybe a quarter of a mile away, and I could hear the drills and see them all working. And then I heard this dead silence and they all vanished. So I thought, they're due to blast and they haven't told me. I think I'll get out of here. So I went down to the other end of the road and stood at the top of a rock embankment, watching the end of the dam to see the explosion going off, make sure it was quite safe. And I looked down, and to my horror, I saw there were about 20 or 30 wires leading into detonators and explosive in the ground under my feet. And in fact, half the squad had been drilling, and the other half had been charging this place where I stood. I was petrified for a moment, but I belted up the hillside. I've never moved so fast in my life. And in fact, I only got a short way up when it went off. Lumps of rock passed clean over my head and I managed to survive.
Those locomotives in and out, first of all, the diesel reek out of them was terrible. You might go on a mile with no bulb, no light at all, just driving away in the dark. There was only clamps on them, and with the vibration sometimes the clamps used to shake off and throw the men across the wall of the tunnel. And I tell you, often I thought since, we're very lucky to be alive.
One day, for instance, I had 3 killed in one incident. They were blasting a shaft up the way, and they sent 3 men, one after the other, up to see if the fumes had cleared of the gelignite. And
one by one, they fell 300 feet down the shaft and were killed. So, of course, every time there was a death at work like that, there had to be a fatal accident inquiry. And to support this fatal accident inquiry, you had to have a post-mortem. So the problem was to get the bodies to Inverness for a post-mortem. That might sound quite simple, but you weren't allowed to hire a hearse. The local authority wouldn't pay for it. You weren't allowed to use the ambulance because the ambulance wouldn't transport dead bodies. And they had no suitable vehicles at Clooney Camp, although Mitchells were very supportive. The only thing they would give you was a lorry. So that day I had to wrap these 3 bodies in blankets, throw them onto the back of an open lorry and get them taken to Inverness. But at that time, see, that's the money we were thinking about. Earning the money, and we weren't thinking, I never thought I was unsafe at all. I didn't see the dangers whatsoever. And but we got away with it, thank goodness.
The work camps, sometimes cannibalized out of abandoned military installations, were temporary villages. The villagers, Irishmen, Central Europeans and Highlanders alike, were a prime source of stories and songs for folklorist and collector Helen Fullerton.
I got down to Lochs, just outside Inverary, and that's Glenshira. And there's a big camp there, huge, one of the biggest of the hydro scheme camps. And I found hold of somebody and said I would like a job. Was there a job in the canteen, in the cookhouse? They call it a cookhouse. And it so happened that 2 of the lassies had just left that day. They'd had a fallout with the cook, and they'd walked off. And so they took me on straight away. I was just a godsend.
Conditions at the Shira camp were to lead Helen Fullerton into protest and confrontation with Carmichael's, the site contractors. They also inspired her to compose a bold and bitter, doggedly proud ballad, later set to music by Geordie McIntyre.
There's a place that's overgrown with green at the foot o' Shira Glen. 11 years a home from home for Carmichael's men. We come and tend the Susans. They build a Shira dam, and the gathering know a fortunate was every navvy's plan. At 6 a.m. you're all...
They had their breakfast, and then they were given 3 sandwiches, 1 of spam, 1 of that rubbery cheese, and 1 of jam. And the phrase was, spam and jam built the main dam.
If the gaffer didn't like your face, it's Paddy, are you tired? I'll keep you free on howling rain, get down the hill you're fired. But if your face was mighty fit, you'd work the winter through. And what you'd make in the wind and rain, you'd melt in the mountain dew.
The men got so fed up with the rotten food and everything that they decided that they would have a strike. And they go on strike until conditions in the cookhouse improved. So they all down tools. And they had a strike meeting. And Carmichael came to a meeting. He got up on a chair and he said, there's no barbed wire around this place. You don't have to work here, you can walk away. But on the other hand, for the next day after that, I think they got chicken. And the next day they got better meat. And then the next day, Carmichael sacked the ringleaders of the strike, the spokesmen. And they never got a job in Shira again, and they were blacklisted all over the schemes.
But the swan it still cries on loch and dew, and the seagull on the sea. And city lights and clacking lights are burning merrily. The Shira it's a bonny dam, and nothing more remains. And the lads who died a building her a could be other name.
Safety standards improved through the 50s, and with them living conditions in the camps. Company stores provided little more than basics, and the bulging wallets and bigger appetites of the workers were a strong incentive to local enterprise.
We had a Ford Thames van which only had one chair in it for the driver, one seat in it, and I sat in a biscuit tin with a cushion on it, on top of a metal floor. So one minute my nose was pressed against the glass, and the next minute I was in the back and among the bread and the rolls and pork chops and things like that. I suppose fresh fruit was in short supply, and there was one Polish gentleman who asked my father to bring him red apples. Never mind the cost, I want big red apples. One chap whose credit rating wasn't very good, he asked Dad to bring him some steaks. And Dad asked him, did he have anything that he could give as security? And well, he didn't have a watch, and he didn't have, a wallet or whatever. So Dad asked him to give him his teeth. And he said, yup. He says, how am I going to eat the steak, without any teeth? Well, that's your answer.
Camp cinemas were a good deal less smoke-free than depicted in this 1956 company record film. But entertainments there were for men who played hard as well as worked hard, and for whom a dance was more a matter of red-bloodedness than white heather.
The company tried to do it in the camp on Fridays, and they used to boss young ladies from Dumbarton, and later on even as far as Gourock and Greenock, how they came over, must have been by boats and then buses, It was quite a nice time. It was had by everybody.
As far as we were concerned, dances weren't really dances at all. They were just fights and riots. We attended the dances as often as we could because we knew fine if we didn't attend them, we'd be called there eventually anyway.
I used to enjoy dancing because it was much the same as the Cayley dancing that we danced at home. So that took the worst out of it, the loneliness out of it here, you see.
I took a fiddle with me and I had the fiddle under the bed. That time, after leaving home and young, it was all Gaelic I had, say. And I was afraid to have a conversation with anybody in English. Though I understood it well and speak a little, but I wasn't very good at it.
And every Friday night we used to gather, go out to the wet canteen, and everybody was a bit lonely, all right, and we were only young, and we would have a few bottles, and that time a very common drink that was here, what they called the screw tops. There were a big bottle, pint bottle with a screw top on. We would take a carry out of them into the hut, and we'd sit at the end of the beds, and we would start there. We sat there and drank the screw top and played and sang until the early hours of the morning. And that's how we passed the weekend. We were trying to make a home away from home, and that's what we made out of it.
Then fare thee well, sweet Eliza dear, likewise to Derry town. And thrice farewell to my comrades all, who dwell on that sainted ground. If fortunate ever should favour me, or I to have money in store, I'll come back and I'll wed the wee lassie I left on Paddy's green shamrock shore.
As well as the songs of home, the fiddles, the darts, and the dominoes, there were other, less innocent pastimes.
Yeah, the gambling was the bane of our life at times. They had so much money to spend and so little sense to manage their money that a game of cards and they might lose all their pay before the Thursday night was out. But the main gambling sessions was the Crown and Anchor. It was, I don't know the actual rules of the game, although I should, I dealt with it often enough, but they had a board, and whatever it was on this board, they put bets on it.
The Crown and Anchor paid out double. You know. And this was a very, very fast game. That game was designed to grab all the money out of you as quickly as you could. And what happened, if I didn't go to Glasgow, I used to stand and make sure I had a lot of change, 2 shilling and half crowns in my pocket, because that's how the game started, you know. And the bankers never had enough change to pay out. So I had pockets full of money, and they knew that. So I was changing. They were giving me pound notes, and I was giving them, for every pound note, I was giving them 18 shillings. Towards the end of the game, I was giving them pound notes, and they were giving me change, but they were giving me 22 shillings for every pound note I used. So I gained 4 shillings on every transaction over the night, you know.
All went well until somebody started losing money, and the money was on the board, and somebody would just tip the board up because they were losing money, and of course then the fight would start. You could get 60 men in a hut playing Crown and Anchor at the one time, and we used to go in and break it up. The Crown and Anchor board would disappear as if by magic. You don't know where it went, it just disappeared. But then you would get sort of missiles thrown at you, like cups and shoes and Wellington boots and eggs and things like this, you know. They'd come out of the dark, you'd never see who threw them. You turn round and of course there's nobody there. Weekends we would go down to Glasgow, which was a great town for dances. And then we would go and get a measurement for a suit in Burton. They all done it. You wouldn't buy nothing off the peg that time.
Tunnel Tigers, that was our trademark, you know. Very good quality clothes, you know. Jackson Taylor and things like that. American ties come into vogue, you know. Very extravagant ties. And I remember I used to walk into Locarno or other dance halls, you know, and when they looked, they, oh my goodness, all like canaries, you know.
We had plenty of money to buy good suits and we were well dressed and everything. Because if you weren't dressed, as they called it, modestly dressed, that meant you had to have a collar and tie on, you wouldn't get in.
And even shopkeepers used to say, oh my God, Tamil tigers with tuxedos on, that's a fact. And bowler hats and everything, oh my God. No real. So that was sort of entertaining. We worked very hard and we played hard.
It wasn't just the hydro workers who worked hard, played hard, and some of them prospered. Neil MacDonald's father had progressed from driving a van to running a hotel.
The busiest morning would be when the camp had their annual holidays, because they didn't have staggered working in these days. They actually closed the camp for 2 weeks, or whatever it was, in the summertime. And the train would come to the station, and I think it was about 1:30 or 2 o'clock, and of course the boys would have been in the bar since it opened at 11. All dressed up with their suits and their suitcases, and then the train would come, and the first ones would leave, and the stragglers were still having a quick pint while the train was actually sitting in the station, but they knew that the train would stay there until everybody got on board. Sometimes it would be there for maybe 10 minutes. It was an amazing sight. Hundreds of people with collars and ties and suitcases. And then just absolute silence when they went away.
As dams were completed and schemes became operational, Tom Johnston's bargain with the Highlands, the people of the Highlands as well as those who owned them, was fulfilled. If hydroelectricity was to be exported south for the growing needs of post-war industry, the farms and crofts of the glens would be supplied as well, and with no connection charges levied.
It was an exciting time because we were all looking forward to this connecting up. There was no shortage of work, I'll tell you. You work at long days and they were at you can hear when you come into me tomorrow maybe. Oh, I says, will I be here next week? And I didn't please him, so you had to try and keep ahead of him. You sent off a form, the job was completed, and within a couple of days maybe the linesman come in and connected them up, you see, and my God, they were absolutely delighted. It was a great exciting time because they were working tele lamps, and some of that old crafters, they weren't even working tele, some of them again were just lanterns and old-fashioned lamps. Most modern firms had tele lamps, of course, but tele lamps are hellish.
I remember going to one of my neighbours and saying to him, this electric's a great thing, what do you appreciate most about it? Not having to go out to the bar in the morning with an old oil lamp. And he gave me an old-fashioned look, and he said, man, the electric bucket's a wonderful thing.
Mr. and Mrs. McClelland of Kyle are choosing a new electric cooker. They'll get their power cheap from the profit the board makes selling current to the grid. If all the plants were complete and working today, 1/7 of all the power the people of Britain need would flow from north of Scotland hydroelectric generating stations.
The drumbeat of the propagandists had never quite silenced those who had opposed Johnston's vision, but as vision became a literally concrete reality, the fears that had so loudly been expressed faded somewhat.
Sadly, my father died long before the scheme even started, so he never saw any of the effects of it, but I'm sure he would be gracious enough to accept that it hadn't done very much harm to the local scenery. And in fact, in some parts of Scotland, it's almost enhanced it.
Environmental concerns, especially with regard to fish movement and stocks, could never be ignored, and the North of Scotland Hydroelectric Board in its heyday made much of its own sensitivity. Calculation of the environmental balance sheet has become tighter over the years, perceptions ever more critical, and for some, the sense of loss will never be wiped away by whatever profit in terms of material comfort and convenience.
There's so few folk living up here now. The hydro scheme's finished off, but the last clearances had started.
It hardly takes a poet to see the tangled roots of a drowned, drought-exposed Caledonian pine as a metaphor for Highland clearance, but for a man who saw his own childhood home drowned with the damming of Loch Mona, the pain is real enough.
The surveyors came up perhaps in 1948 and stayed with us. They stayed there for about a month, surveying everything and taking levels and that, and told us their plans, and that was the start of our troubles. The end of the life in the glen for us, we knew that. But it was a bit sad leaving you, knowing you weren't going to see anything again. It was all going to be underwater. And my father and mother were due to retire anyway, but they were a bit upset. And they were taken back for a couple of days or a week to work later on. And by that time they were pulling down our old home and that, and burning Strathmore. And my mother was most upset. She wished she hadn't gone back, she said. People say how beautiful it is, and to me it's not beautiful. It looks terrible compared to what it was 40, 50 years ago. Because even raising the loch 10 feet you'd have lost everything. The agricultural land is around the sides of rivers and lochs, and all this was gone with a dam, even a small dam.
Ian Mackay's personal verdict would be not so much contradicted as obliterated by the 1960s dream of a white heat of technology. Even as advanced pump storage schemes like Cruachan underground in what became known as the Hollow Mountain and fires on Loch Ness were getting underway, a new Jerusalem of nuclear electricity, too cheap to meter at a domestic level, was being preached. Other forces were gathering too.
My mail was delivered to me one day, and among the mail was a letter from Ames of Industry. Now, coming from from 4 years of active politics, I knew straight away who these people were. Many folk won't believe it nowadays, but here was a body set up solely for the destruction of nationalisation. No other purpose. And sure enough, from that small beginning, there mounted the enormous swell anti-hydro board.
Cruachan, jewel in the crown of hydro board achievement, was also the end of an era. For the rest of the 20th century, hydroelectricity, almost as easy to turn on and off as a kitchen tap, took on a largely strategic reserve role, good for TV sets and World Cup half-time kettles, while coal and later North Sea oil and gas did the UK's donkey work, and the Highland dams became part of the landscape. But today, belief in the white heat of technology has cooled to a reality of global warming, and hydroelectricity, renewable and non-pollutant, has once again a future. Plans and surveys of half a century ago are being dusted down. Hydro days may come again, though maybe not the way things were.
The old bar had a counter which was marble topped, and we took the marble top with us, which was in 3 sections. So one was broken in transit, but I have the other one, another one as a hearth at home in Bilochry. And the other one, interestingly enough, was made into a tombstone by my cousin, who's a monumental sculptor. But the tombstone is erected now in St Clement's Church in Rodel in Harris, admired by many. But they don't know that it's thousands of pints of beer have crossed that, and Irish elbows were leaning on that. But maybe you do now.
Let the money move the Merrick side, the great land back and on. At Morriston the hills grew pale, he fought and drank through Old Dale, till the money soon was gone. Then I crossed the loch sides autumn rain, winter whiskey in the plain, till the spring returned to the hills again, and my heart leaped at its song. So I came at night to Cosheville with a dozen bells